Welcome to the God is Not an Asshole podcast. If you are one of the many people done with religious dogmatism, hang on. You might sense transcendence, but your church or other faith community never seem to get off the ground. You realize that honoring your conscience means more than fitting in and keeping hard-to-explain rules? Hang on. You could probably think of the goodness in your tradition, and you tried your best to save that baby, but there's so much bathwater. Join your hosts, David Norman Moore Jr. in California and Carrie Connolly in New Jersey, who are collaborating to bring on guests who have found life on the other side of fundamentalism. Guests with stories of how they have liberated themselves from beliefs that divide us from each other. None of our guests' narratives are identical, but we hope you'll find something in common with each of them. We invite you to experience our common bond as we all inspire even more of us to embrace the true self.
All right, friends, welcome to our show. And Carrie and I are delighted to have with us today Matt Lowe. Matt lives here in Santa Barbara. He is a disability liberation theology scholar. And while the majority of his work surrounds racial reparations, he had to repair his own relationship with disability. At the age of 16, Matt lost his vision from a genetic disease and would find himself transition from a life path of hockey playing to a life path of restorative justice. In fact, his dream was to be in the NHL. He was born in the burbs, but raised in the hood of East Oakland. Matt's coming of age left him with many questions of race, disability, humanity, love. He's a contemplative activist, and he enters into spaces of liminality as a community healer and also somebody still in healing. Matt identifies as a Franciscan Pentecostal that tries to live a life that would make Paulo Freire proud. So I'm going to ask you, Matt, to go ahead and explain what a Franciscan Pentecostal is and also share with us Paulo Freire.
Yeah. Franciscan Pentecostal is kind of like just a spiritual nut, if you will, just a Mennonite and a Pentecostal and a Franciscan. I just love how rooted in the earth Franciscans are, and the peace activism and the peace activism that is rooted in the Mennonite tradition and the spirit-filledness that comes from the Pentecostal tradition. So I'm a borrower and appreciator of many traditions, and just ultimately saying, don't put me in a box,
I hate boxes too.
Right. What box? I mean, I don't even see a box, so I don't know what you're talking about. There's no boxes. We ain't playing with boxes. We don't play that game.
All right. And tell us about, Carrie?
I'm curious, and maybe I should let you ask what you were going to ask, but I'm really curious about how you define restorative justice. I think that's I'm not sure that a lot of people are familiar with that term. So I want to know how you define it.
Yeah. I realized I didn't answer David's question about Paulo Freire. And let me do that one because I think it may lead into the restorative justice question, actually.
Go for it.
In the sense that Paulo Freire is a Brazilian educator. He was taught literacy to poor people in Brazil and was kicked out of the country during the revolution. And essentially what he thought or saw was that poor people were not being educated because they did not want to be taught about their experience. And if you kept people uneducated, then you could keep them separate and disempowered. And so he came, I believe he went to Chile, and then he was actually a professor at Harvard for a long while, and wrote this famous book called Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Pedagogy just simply means what we teach, how we teach. And fun fact, pedagogy, Brown versus Board of Education, 1955, didn't completely end desegregation or discrimination. It still allowed it through pedagogy. So this is why pedagogy is so important. But Pedagogy of the Oppressed talks about our education system of you can have You can move from one fundamentalism to another fundamentalism if you don't heal, if you don't step into the subjective experience, because they're rooted in the same fatalistic outcomes. So if we don't heal, if we don't grieve, if we don't learn what it means to be with one another and step into our subjective human experience, our lived experience, then it'll just continue the same harm because it's rooted in objectivity. Objectivity is rooted in this education system that Paulo Freire calls banking. And so that's what our traditional education system is, which means how much knowledge can you stuff in there and recall it at a particular time, aka for a test or for a particular purpose, and bank it, put it all in there, say that I have all this money in there, and then withdraw it at a certain point. That's what Paulo Freire calls the banking model. And he encourages us that is a tool of the oppressor. That is a tool that keeps us out of our own lived experience and in objectivity. And so he's saying we need to step into our subjectivity to become fully alive. And so, yeah, that's what we step into. So that as Paulo Freire, there's a healing aspect to that. And so the question that came to me in restorative justice, it's so funny. I thought I was being this revolutionary person as an undergrad. I was a history and Black studies major. And as a history student, I was my senior thesis was on truth and reconciliation commissions within universities in the United States. So I was studying like Harvard and Princeton and Yale and their actions towards repairing slavery. And I was like, they were asking the questions like, well, what do we do? You know, I was like, what is true restorative justice? And I'm like, I didn't know what field I was stepping into, that indigenous practices have been practicing this for millennia, you know, and, but restorative justice simply asks the question, what is the next greatest step of healing? And there's a process that it takes, to go through. There's, 4 basic questions that kind of guide you through the process of who was harmed, what is the harm, who are the stakeholders involved, and then what is the next greatest step of healing. Restorative justice frames it as a process of healing, instead of punishment. Oftentimes in our current systems, we're taught to punish, do the time for the crime.
Okay.
So restorative justice is the opposite. What is the greatest amount of healing for the harm that was done? And it doesn't pin people as like a victim versus offender. Instead, hey, this is somebody that was harmed, and here's somebody that was involved in that, and what is the greatest amount of healing that can take place? And it really looks at the communal aspect. It doesn't view it as us versus them. It makes it a trifecta. It makes it dynamic. It makes it, to me, it makes it spiritual, because there's 1, 2, and 3. And when there's 3, it's dynamic. It's not just there's communal involvement. There's input by, people that are all impacted, not just this person versus this person. So.
Yeah, I love that. It's really fascinating because in the work that I do, I often talk about the wound of dominance, right? The soul wound of dominance. There's a wounding in dominant identities. And then I was reading My Grandmother's Hands by
Resma
Renicum, who refers to that. But then he also, in a footnote, talks about that indigenous peoples here in North America referred to the soul wound of the colonizers who were coming and decimating their people. So I think that truth, when it catches us, we discover it's already made its rounds. But I think that's a good sign. Yeah.
I can't help but to reflect on, Matt, as you were talking here in town. Our church hosted Diana Galindo Roybal a week and a half ago, and she is the a local superintendent of schools, and she talked about literacy and how their statistics, their analyses needed to be racialized, and the importance of education. And she used her own story as someone who couldn't read when she was in the 2nd grade, and she had a teacher who took out time to help her. So how does that fit in, that narrative fit in your perspective on restorative justice and Paulo Freire especially?
Well, the teacher stepped into the lived experience. She did not know what Diana was going through as a young child, but stepped in as a teacher and didn't just view herself as an adversary to the child of like getting this child through the second grade or whatever, but instead as a community member. So she stepped in as a dual member, as a teacher and a community member at that moment. And it involved the parents, I guess in some way of like stepping into the home, and stepping into the lived experience of the human and like, what is actually going on here? You know, they knew, the teacher knew that there was something was off, you know? And so, hey, why? You know, the subjective experience stepping into that, all it takes is that asking of why. And there's a fear of asking why, because when we uncover what is underneath, then that can be really scary. And so that's kind of what has happened with ethnic studies. Ethnic studies, when we're asking for that to be taught in high schools or, you know, colleges, all we're doing is trying to uncover why things happen the way they happen. And we're stepping into the lived experience and be like, oh, what would we do different? Like, how would things be run? And that is scary to those in positions of power that are rooting themselves in that fatalistic tendency.
This is reminding me, and bear with me because I'm going to bring this back around, but I just recently read an article in the New York Times about the guy. It was an interview with the guy who founded Rolling Stone magazine. And this guy was a jerk. I'm just going to say it. And one of the things that he said was that he's recently written a book, and the interviewer was pointing out that all of the guys that he interviewed were, first of all guys, and they were all white, from rock and roll, Bono, Mick Jagger, etc. And what this guy actually had the nerve to say, yes, masters, exactly. What this guy actually had the nerve to say when the interviewer asked him why he didn't interview any women or black artists was because those people don't have the intellectual prowess to philosophize about the music industry. So people like Joni Mitchell and Grace Slick, and you know, and I was just sitting there, and he goes, you know, I mean, the guy goes, well, how do you know? And he said, well, because I've read interviews with them, and I've listened to their music, and I've read interviews with them. And the thing that I've said was that he's never paying attention to the fact that all of those interviews were through the lens of the patriarchal, racist music industry, right? So he didn't want to ask a question about what is Joni Mitchell's philosophy on the music industry, because he was judging her based on interviews that already came through a lens of patriarchy and, you know. And so I just think it's fascinating, because when we think about education and the ways that education prepares students for whiteness, for a white society, and a patriarchal society, and a society of dominance and hierarchy, and how so much of that is so subtle. It's not even in the curriculum. It is in the curriculum, but it's not just in the curriculum. It's in the ways that teachers more harshly discipline young black boys than they do white boys, right? And then what happens is, not only does that get internalized by the black body, but it also gets internalized by the white bodies in the room, who are looking at the black bodies and saying, oh, that body is inherently more disruptive or something because of the way the teacher is responding to them. So I'm curious about your thoughts. Like,
and Carrie, let me just jump in. And I think they're not more disruptive, but I think they have a right to be.
Absolutely, 100%, indeed.
So there's a phrase in disability culture called acting up, and acting up is a form of, one, rebellion, but two, it's an expression. So acting up could be somebody just causing a scene, you know, somebody just being upset, somebody that has a more loud voice or doesn't have emotional or voice regulation or has a stutter and just kind of like they can get mad or they can get emotional. It doesn't have like, they don't have the normalcy that everybody in society is expecting of a human in a particular situation. So it's called acting up, and it's something that disability culture has taken back and has a sense of pride about. And so in the way of rebelling against the banking system, I see Black culture, Latinx communities, disability communities rebelling against the acting up, the behavioral or emotional outbursts that are being punitive or being punished are things that are responsible and on the hands of the education system. For instance, if there was a curriculum that was reading that, if there was an English class that was teaching about maybe in a predominantly Latinx community and was reading books on the Bracero revolution or the Bracero program and the building of the Latinx communities in Southern California and how that developed into the lowrider community, and how they developed into the Chicano culture, So if there was a contextual part, something that was understanding, and they weren't being forced to read To Kill a Mockingbird or 1984, then they might have something of interest and not be quote unquote acting up, or they won't be distracted or talking in class or talking back, And if the professor wasn't trying to shove something down their throat to make them learn to get a test score, then it wouldn't be the oppressive aspect of the system wouldn't be present. So, which is why we need to step into the subjective.
Yeah. And another interesting dynamic in that, or another interesting point in that dynamic, is the ways in which the dominant culture responds to such acting up. For Black and brown bodies, it's punitive responses. And for white bodies, it's usually medicated or treated. It's behavioral. And, we have to help this student as opposed to punish this student, right? Which is the basis of the school to prison pipeline, et cetera, and so forth.
And another thing that I didn't mention earlier about you that I appreciate and respect is your commitment to doing the work as a man. And that's I think that the people that we are around are kind of a refuge from the toxicity in our culture. Because it just doesn't make sense to hold on to ways of the past. So tell us a bit about why it's important for you.
Yeah, I don't really talk too much about it yet, and that's intentionally because I'm going to be launching a program for the Healing Men Project. It's a project that I've been working on for a while, but this is not launched yet, so I don't really talk about it too much. It's helping men address the wounds of patriarchy so we can become better contributors in the world. And for me, that root is from disability, that idea of being othered. So my sister had brain cancer when she was 6 years old and I was 8 years old. So had a lot of residual issues for the next 10, 15 years afterwards. Still so much joy, so much love. I saw her as one of the most beautiful humans, an angel sent to earth, whatever you want to call it. And she was my guiding. She was my guiding light. Helped me get through my vision loss when I was 16. But I also saw the way society treated her. I saw the way society othered her. I saw the way she was left out. I saw the way the medical system it tried, but it didn't fully care for her. It didn't accept her. It made things really hard. And I saw the logics in the way that people thought about her, the way they saw her as an animal. They savageized her, and beast. They referred to her as a beast. That's not, if there was an emotional outbreak. And my heart, well, not say my heart, but like my experience, my purview of the world was softened because of this experience. I saw how much, on one hand, the world treated her with such disdain, but on the other hand, I saw how much love and vitality and joy this human had. And so I'm like, why are you treating this human this way? And so that experience of disability really informed the way that I would feel about my own disability. And then being a white man with a disability is a whole nother thing, because I'm having to, the whole concept of patriarchy is one that is predicated about domination and being on top. And my way is the only way. And it's the entitlements, the shut downness. And the way of disability is one of joy, one of expression, one of co-empowerment, one of peace, one of welcomeness, and joining together in community. Community is our power. And so disability goes into direct contradiction of what patriarchy is. And so I was made fun of. I was left out. So I was softened in not only my sister's experience, but then in my own experience
that developed
later. And I'm like, oh, this wasn't just her experience. This was also my experience. And then I also had the questions around race in my head and how that intersected with patriarchy and disability as well too. So, I'd say that's kind of where it started for me.
Yeah. I think, Matt, you and I have talked about this before, but I have noticed in my encounters with men that when they have someone in their family, particularly a sibling with a disability, it can be really transformative. And sometimes I will meet the person, the man, and not know anything about them. And then I'll be captivated by their humanity. And even if it's not the case, I wonder if he has a family member with a disability, because it's just so remarkable to me.
I'm not sure. I haven't put this on record in writing anywhere, and maybe I'll get some pushback on it, but it's just coming to mind right now. I'd say disability, or dealing with disability, stepping into disability, the experience of it, there's a very wide spectrum of it. So this is where I would get pushback, but it's the closest thing that you can get to death in the human experience of the fragility of life. And I've sat next to my sister while she's been on life support in the hospital. I've, heard machines flatline. I've had to confront death and the fragility of our human experience. And so I've had to ask the question of love and what it means to be human at a much younger age. And when men do that, it really gives them the perspective, that life is short, that, there's more to it. All right. It makes them wake up to their heart, honestly. Like, they shut their heart down so much in their life, makes them aware of their soul and the connectedness with other people's pain. And suffering is the great equalizer. And so when we go through that, and if we open ourselves up to it, it can be the great equalizer.
One of the things that I often say is that straight white Christian men in America tend to be, and able-bodied, I should say, also tend to be outside what I call the circle of empathy, right? In that, if I, as a white woman, I don't know what it means to walk around in a black or brown body, but I do know what a microaggression feels like, right?
Yep.
I know the choices that need to be made in that moment. Do I choose between my safety or my dignity and fight back, or like, what do I do, right? I think that what you're pointing to there is that idea that something, and when I say that those men are outside the circle of empathy, I don't mean that they cannot experience empathy. What I mean is that they have to extend a greater stretch of imagination intentionally in order to understand the way their dominance does harm.
Yeah.
And so what you're pointing to is that it's something that moves them into that circle of empathy. And that can be such a beautiful, it gives me hope for all of the pain that this life can bring, because it means that there might be some sense of healing for this wound of dominance, right? That otherwise just seems to perpetuate itself over and over and over again, generation after generation.
It also starts to show a little bit why society numbs us and gives us all these medications so that we don't feel pain. And so pain is actually really important. It's pain is not bad. Pain is, cause pain is where we find out who we are. It's necessary. It's, my blindness is beautiful. No, but I don't want to change who I am. And I meet other disabled people in the community that say the same exact thing. So it's not bad. It's beautiful. And
So shifting gears a little bit, then I'm really curious to know how you feel about the ways so often the quote healings in scripture are treated, as
let's go.
yeah, let's do it. I really want to hear your thoughts on this.
All right.
Go for it.
So this is the stuff I love because there's so much. Well, one, we'll just start with patriarchy rooted in scripture, all the way going back to Genesis. And then
Yes.
two,
Yes, thank you.
ableism. So I just kind of get some foundational theory that I'm working with. So, like I said, race is completely tied up in my concept of disability. I didn't come into my anti-ableism work or disability work until after I went through all of my studies on race, my bachelor's, my master's,
I
understanding white
was there
supremacy.
for a part of that.
Yeah, they was part of that. And so I had a liberating moment where I started understanding ableism. And it was I recognized my internalized self-hatred. And so there was so many things that taught me to hate my body, what I did, my disability, who I am, and it informed the way that I should move in this world. I shouldn't speak up. I can go to groups and be an activist, but I'm not going to say anything. Disability is not important. I'm not a leader. I can't say what I think is right. I'll just sit in the back seat. I can't start this thing. I don't deserve to get paid this. And all those types of things. And there's a logic. Andrea Smith talks about the logics of white supremacy, and the logic of ableism is disempowerment. So anything that is rooted in disempowerment is rooted in ableism. And so I just read a book the other day that said ableism is to disabilityism as patriarchy is to misogyny. And I was like, yes, somebody finally naming that. Like, that was just very, very clearly named. I just learned that last week. So we're all on that journey still learning. And, and then also just as a preemptive thing, race tied in with disability. There's a creator, I can't remember their name right now, but they said, racial inferiority. The first excuse was biological. And because it's biological, it is now rooted in ableism. So racism is rooted in ableism. And to me, that goes back because ableism goes farther back than the concept of race. It goes back 5,000, 10,000 years, so it's I would argue as one of the original wounds, even before patriarchy. And so the concepts in which we find our interconnection with, that we find our intersectionality with ableism, we have to do the work with race and gender and sexuality and disability as well too, because it's so essential. Because if we don't come home to disability, we're not going to come home, or if we don't come home to disability, we're not going to come home to our bodies and all those other forms. And so the scriptures, this is where we get disability and faith interconnected. And I get all turned up. So the famous one that people often ask me about because I'm blind, and they're like, oh, it's the where the rich young, or not the rich young ruler, where the leader the disciple goes to Jesus and says, who sinned, the father or the mother of this blind person? And they're like, oh, and especially because my disease is genetic, so they're like, oh, it must have been passed down. And I get that question so much, even the question around geneticness, because people like want to know, are my genes messed up? Did my family sin at one point and mess up my lineage? The superiority of lineageness, and the purity of a good human. That's rooted in white supremacy. And so when we think of those scriptures through the lens of disability, I don't think they're actually, so the disciples, yes, maybe they're coming from a disableist perspective, but it's the theology in which that it's actually coming from. So it's not the disciples, it's the theology. And the theology is understanding the ancestral lineages. So I don't think they actually understood genetic diseases and the superiority of like, oh, this person is going to be damaged. They had an idea of clean versus dirty in their community, and somebody had sinned. And so they had a way of kind of keeping people out that were unclean and that were, not welcome. And so their logics were a little messed up and kind of not logical. So it's not about a genetic disease. It's about understanding the contextual time period and whether people were clean or dirty so that other people didn't get contaminated with quote unquote deformed disabilities, The other one that I often talk about is the one where the people, like the famous one where people bring their wheelchair or they carry the guy and drop him through the ceiling to Jesus, and how a miracle that was. And we have to understand that houses weren't built in the same way. You didn't have to climb onto somebody's roof at that time period. And houses weren't built with sticks and stuff like that. They were kind of built on hillsides and like with a little bit of material over the edge for like the entryway. And so lifting somebody down was actually a form of accessibility. It's something we do in the disability community. Like sometimes pre curb cuts, there were no access for wheelchairs. You couldn't go travel through the community. So people had to lift the person to travel. Like that was a normal thing. That was not a miracle. That was not abnormal for Jesus to experience somebody being lifted down into that, because a house was often built on the hillside and somebody maybe would have normally jumped or maybe taken a different path that was longer, but somebody being lifted down and maybe that had maybe a bum leg or, maybe had maybe some muscular dystrophy going on or something.
So,
so understanding context is super important.
Context is so important, and it's often missed. What I'm curious about though is, I think one of the ways that I've tried to think about it or played with thinking about it is the idea that what Jesus was actually doing when he was quote healing, and I'm always using air quotes, right? Because what is healing really, right? Is it really saying making a blind person no longer blind? Is that true healing? Or was the healing the restoration to community, right? Because I think so much of it is not so much, because if we say, oh, Jesus took away this person's blindness, that somehow inherently is saying that blindness is not beautiful or good or cool, right?
Yeah.
But it's about restoring that person to community because of the social constructs that removed that person from community.
Exactly.
Right. It's about the social construct, not and healing the social construct, not healing that human being who was perfectly beautiful and in God's sight.
Yeah. So David and I had a conversation.
No. Help me find the right language around that.
You are on point. You're teaching already. So David and I were having this conversation actually a couple of months ago because we read a book around the same time unknowingly, and it talked about disability in the indigenous perspective. Is the way they view it, and the book talked about it this way: if disability is the separation from community, whereas in our Western modern world, disability is your inability to produce and create a commodity for society. So disability is based upon labor.
Wait, can you say that? Because that's really important.
Absolutely. That's the intersectionality with capitalism. Well, not to say capitalism, but labor, because it's not just in capitalism, that we need to recognize as well too, because what any form, and this is where we get into teaching about the medical model or the social model or the charity model. The charity model is something that the church really promoted after the Renaissance, and then the medical model came in once we started getting all this medical technology in the 20th century. And then the social model is where we start to really understand systems of disadvantage and power and things like that. And we understand how labor plays a role in it, because I won't get hired because I can't see something. It's too much effort too much money for Starbucks to create an accessible program on their checkout systems or to put Braille on their things. So it's a cost. It's a cost to create a system that works for me. And it's also a cost for time to create a product. And then also it takes longer for someone like me to do something. So I'm just not deemed as fit for the labor force. And the same thing for military. I'm they're not going to give me a gun, but recruiters don't go after people with disabilities. Like they're not seen as valuable. So it's a form of, again, the logic of disempowerment. So like, we're just seen as to be put into the welfare system of like, okay, yeah, we're here in society, but find your own way. Hopefully you can start to find something maybe in human services where, you can make a menial wage and, just make it through life. And so it's not seen as a place of, hey, we need to empower that this person has great skills and strengths.
Yeah, the irony is, you mentioned the military. Yeah, but a lot of the people that end up leaving the military leave with disabilities they didn't have
exactly
when they went in, and so it's just it's an exploitation in many ways. A commodification of human lives.
The root of disability activism actually stemmed out of the military after World War I, and then really extended after World War II. And then into the 60s, really gained power because there was so many veterans after World War II and then after Vietnam that had disabilities. They're like, I don't want to live this way. And so it was only after the wars where white men came back from war and realized that they didn't have a life and they weren't supported and they weren't given the same GI benefits, and the veterans hospitals didn't care for them and just kind of discarded them and said, they were given a premium care. And then, came the 504 sit-in and then the ADA.
So much of what you're talking about too is just pointing in my mind to the intersectionality of all of this within the construct of capitalism, because I have been a stay-at-home mom for the past 20 or so years, and now I'm going through a divorce and I'm completely unhireable, right? That's the situation that I'm in right now. And I am in a situation with I was having a conversation with my girlfriend the other day who's in a very similar situation, and she still has two very special needs kids at home. And she's like, don't I get any credit for all of the stuff that I do to manage their schooling and I still hold down a job, and I still am the one who makes sure all the bills get paid and runs this household. She's like, don't I get any credit for any of that labor? And so the idea of how we value different types of labor, and that the only kind of that the labor or the gifts that you would bring to the world as a person who is blind is somehow less valued than somebody who has sight, right?
Yeah.
It's just a really fascinating thing that happens in the undercurrents of our society that we don't pay attention to until we do. And that's what I hope this podcast episode is going to bring up for people.
Yeah, my mom's in that same situation, so I get that. And yeah, there's no resources even for care providers either. So let alone for people with disabilities. So the system strips us. It's a hip hop artist, Brother Ali says, if you take welfare, they're going to put you in hell there. So
yeah, indeed.
Thank you so much for being here today. We are people who have left behind performance-based religion and the shame that comes with it. Maybe you have a personal liberation story to tell, and we want to know about it. Please contact us on Twitter at GodIsNotAnAsshole or text 805-703-8393, because the world needs to know that God is not an asshole.